On this episode of China Unscripted, how U.S.-China policy changed under Trump, why China is threatened by American freedom, and China's obsession with Taiwan's democracy. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
And I'm Matt Kanejda.
And joining us today is Dr. Miles Yu, director of the China Center at the Hudson Institute, visiting fellow at Hoover Institution, and senior fellow at Project 2049 Institute. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
So you were the principal China policy advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. I'm curious, was he on the same page as you at the beginning regarding China?
I think they were on the same page. I mean, of course, the two pages were not created at the same time. I mean, he already had his own understanding of China and the China challenge. And I, of course, as an academic, and I've been working on China all my professional career. So, and I think, on the other hand, it's not really a coincidence that we sort of connected because this is the understanding of China threat is now a national consensus. So a lot of people who are in the China field were reaching that. I might also want to add that Mr. Pompeo is a very unique individual and a senior leader in the American administration in the sense that he's the only person in the history of the United States who both serve as the top American foreign policy leader in covert and overt realms. And he was the CIA director. That's a covert side of that. And then he became a Secretary of State. That's the overt part of the American foreign policy. So he has a very unusual advantage.
What do you think that advantage gave him?
Well, the advantage gave him not just a sort of improvised policy on China based upon instinct and tradition. It has a much deeper understanding of Chinese reality. Much of the policy toward China in Washington, D.C. has mostly been about the Americans' deep, sometimes even sort of pathological self-examination of ourselves. In other words, how hawkish or how dovish we should be about China. And we, based upon China, sort of with some kind of what we wish China want to be, but rather on reality of China. As a top intelligence official in the United States, Mr. Pompeo, before he came to the State Department, had a very, very firm understanding of the nature and the key strengths of the regime and what kind of danger it posed to the United States.
Well, I know under the Trump administration, the U.S.-China policy radically changed. How did you help get the government to pivot to focusing on China as not a partner that can be cooperated with, but a real and present threat?
Well, I don't want to overplay my role in changing the policy. I mean, I'm one of the team, right? So I was fortunate enough to be in a good time and perfect timing, and also to be able to work in Secretary Pompeo's office in a capacity of a lead in the policy planning office on China. So the change came with not just a fresh new knowledge about China, because the China problem has been there for decades, and every American leader knows this. The change came with the advent of political courage, and leadership not only can be demonstrated with deep knowledge and great government support with the bureaucratic empire in the United States, but also you have to make the leader know that all this information about China needs decisive action. And fortunately, this country, we had Donald Trump, who had a very, very good instinct about the most important things that the country needs to do. That's the first principle presidents. But most importantly, when it comes to policy formulation, we're lucky to have Mike Pompeo, who really exhibits a great leadership and decisiveness, and in changing some of the fundamental concepts and practice with regard to China policy. So I was very fortunate and lucky to be able to be a part of that.
Well, speaking of those former practices, did you experience any pushback from people who had made their careers based on the idea of, opening up to China?
Absolutely. I mean, China policy in Washington has been greatly influenced by some unsavory elements. Being an open society, United States obviously has strength, but also has weaknesses over there, particularly on foreign policy. American electorate is profoundly interested in domestic issues, not foreign policy as a whole, even though United States is decisively a global power. So that gives opportunity for, say, for example, the Wall Street to impact American foreign policy, particularly on China. So for a long time, American policy toward China is based upon economic operations. So we ignore the uncompromising, almost confrontational nature of the ideology, political system, institutions. As if U.S.-China relationship is all about making money. And also we do have a lot of influence from K Street, that is a lobbying group. The law firms, the public relations firms, they are the people who basically sign on China's side. China pays them, and they basically create a false narrative about the U.S.-China relationship and exert tremendous influence upon the foreign policy formulation process, particularly with regard to China. The third bad element, I would say, is from the academic and think tank arena. There are many people in Washington, D.C., I would say most of the people in D.C.-based think tanks, their primary approach to U.S.-China relationship is from the foreign policy point of view. That is, how to maintain a stable relationship. So the most popular word in U.S.-China dealings is the word relationship. So their obsession is to maintain it, to make it run correctly, and without much incident and disturbances. But they never consider whether this relationship, the framework itself, is flawed and fundamentally unworkable in the long run. So those three things, I think, they all changed when the Trump team came in, and I think we literally sort of shielded ourselves from the impact of the Wall Street. Not 100%, but I would say 80%, 90%. And Mr. Trump came from New York City, and he knew the high finance. He knew the economic side of the U.S.-China relationship. So he came in as an economic president. He tapped on trade. He tapped on currency. He tapped on the hollowing out of Americans' manufacturing bases by China. So Wall Street had very little impact on him. So that's a very big change. Secondly, on K Street, on lobbying, because President Trump thinks he knows a lot about China, which is not totally wrong, and he really relied heavily on his own instinct and ideas. And because of the particular nature and style of his presidency, there was a very strong dislike of him from the lobby group, which actually is dubiously works just fine. No, we don't need them. Thirdly, from the think tank world, from the foreign policy community, that has been unanimously the case that very few really would like to cooperate with the Trump administration on foreign policy. That gives opportunity, like myself and several of my colleagues, to be able to expand our knowledge and our expertise without much of hindrance. That doesn't necessarily mean we don't get alternative opinions from other sectors of the American society. We do. We just get the correct ones. And I think, For example, we hear a lot from the Chinese dissidents community. We hear a lot from the religious community. We hear a lot from many of the American actually companies that have substantial investments in China, but yet been treated terribly by the Chinese government. So our source of information upon which we make our policy is very different, and that's actually is very fundamentally significant.
Interesting. I remember Trump met with like a whole group of Chinese dissidents. There were Uyghurs, there were Falun Gong practitioners, there were Christians, also I think some people from Vietnam. I wonder if you could tell us some background on that meeting, because I don't think that was something that Bush, Obama, or Biden have done anything like that.
Well, to be fair to previous president, they did meet that. They met with those groups with great caution. And I remember when Dalai Lama went to the White House, Mr. Clinton and Mr. Bush would have to pretend to, I happen to be here to say hello. So that's because we manage our relationship with China through something I call the anger management. That is our preponderant concern of making any policy shift, taking any action, is based on how mad China might be at us if we do A, B, C, and D. That is not only pathetic, but also it's morally incomprehensible. So what the Trump administration did was to not just to antagonize China just for the sake of seeing China getting mad at us. We want to do is through a rational approach of making China realize that the U.S.-China relationship is so comprehensive, so multifaceted. We cannot only focus on one or two areas that China wants us to focus on and forget about everything else, right? So in other words, what we're trying to do to expand the U.S.-China engagement to reflect its true nature, which is multifaceted, multi-dimensional. For example, while we stress the importance of engaging with China economically and on issues also such as North Korean denuclearization and international drug trafficking, we also want China to know that the Chinese government should never, again, expect the United States to say nothing if China locks up millions of ethnic minority in concentration camps. We also made China aware that China should never expect the United States to say nothing or do nothing if they try to take away Hong Kong's freedom and autonomy. So we're trying to engage China from a broad spectrum of perspectives, and China has to get used to that. So it's not just about money. It's not about economic engagement. It's also about much, much more.
You mentioned that a lot of policy in the past had been designed around how much it angers China and trying not to, anger China. And you said this is morally incomprehensible. Could you dig into that a little bit?
The Chinese regime is one of the world's most repressive regime, and their repression is at scale. That's a difference. So you might say, there is a despicable human rights violations in Burma, right? In other countries. Those were absolutely abhorrible. We should really condemn that. But China is a country of enormous size and has enormous influence in the world. And its violation of human rights are committed by a totalitarian theory and by an entire bureaucratic machine. So it's much more systemic, it's much more fundamental, and it poses an existential threat, not just to its neighbors, but also to entire humanity. So we have to take this issue at a much higher scale. So that's why we cannot just, just to address the religious freedom issue by sort of, planning for years and years on how and where to meet Dalai Lama, whether we should shake hands with the Uyghur dissident or not. That's just the morally incomprehensible. And that's why I say that. And also, for example, For years and years, there are countless practitioners of Falun Gong and in China were brutally tortured and repressed. Yet, because we know China is very sensitive about this, no American political leader would like to meet with the Falun Gong, engage with them, even on American free soil. So that all changed during the Trump administration. I myself arranged several meetings between the Falun Gong media and Falun Gong survivors to meet with Secretary Pompeo, and he took the time to meet with them in his office. This is unprecedented. On issue of for example, the Tiananmen massacre that Chinese government committed in 1989. Yes, we have had the former Secretary of State to make some statements on the anniversaries for many years, but no one really take this issue seriously as a reflection of the fundamental difference between the United States and China. That is political, is ideological. And Secretary Pompeo took this very, very seriously. So on the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre, which is 2019, I helped him draft a amazing statement, and he basically added his own thoughts to it. He dictated us on how to respond to this, and that was the most comprehensive, most direct American response to the Tiananmen massacre. Even though it's 30 years too late, but it's better late than never. And he also wanted me to arrange meetings with the Tiananmen survivors. So this is the first time ever by any Secretary of State to do so. And so Mr. Pompeo made some very strong speeches about China. And I think on most of the occasions, he makes sure that there are dissidents representatives in those speeches that focus on China. So all in all, I think it takes political courage and leadership to get our China policy right. And I'm also very, very pleased and extremely gratified that China policy that we changed during the Trump administration have become a national consensus. And the essence, the core of this China policy has been endorsed by the Biden administration China team. For that, I'm very happy as an American and also as a citizen of the world.
Now, I know you also advocated what you called a policy of principled realism. Can you tell us what that means?
To deal with a regime like China, we must have a certain element of realism. Realism is about deals, about transactions. And I think nobody is better than Donald Trump when it comes to making deals. His whole name, name brand is about making deals. But making deals does not necessarily mean we don't care about principles. We cannot just say, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Because in the United States, and we base our foreign policy, we should be based on foreign policy about some very fundamental founding creeds of this nation. All men are created equal, for example, and we're based on the idea of reciprocity. We should have the principle of respect for rules, for example, those things. So when we deal with China, since 1970, since the time of Richard Nixon, we overemphasize on the realism part of that. In other words, we would basically reach secret deals with China on issues, say, Vietnam War, North Korea, or some other aspect of that. And we forget, or Taiwan even, we forget about the principles we must adhere to. So what I'm saying is America is a deeply moralistic country. That's principle side. But we cannot have a Jimmy Carter type of president without understanding that the whole world is full of bad guys, rogue states. So you need some kind of a tough guy approach too. I think in this regard, in my view, FDR, President Roosevelt, a wartime president, was probably has the both sides. He is the principal realism kind of president. That is, he has the element of a fox, and he understands the techniques dealing with the difficult personalities, like Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, for example. He also holds on the principle of America as the bulwark of of world democracy. That's why he also is a lion. Lion has the power of authority, respect, and intimidation. So there's a principle side, there is a realism side. We cannot really ignore one and blindly pursue another.
Now, you mentioned, well, it's clear that the China policy shifts that happened during the Trump administration have stuck, that in the consensus now is that the Chinese Communist Party is a threat. What do you think the Biden administration is doing well, and what else do you think the U.S. should be doing to counter the CCP in this post-Trump, post-COVID era?
Well, I think they're doing the best by agreeing with us. So that's a very big deal. It's not because of how great we are, because of many people inside the Biden administration who are in charge of the China policy today realized even during the Trump administration that our traditional China policy had failed, and they wrote articles, they make speeches echoing what the Trump administration was doing and saying. I say echo of which is different from endorsement. Politics is real too. So, but we all have this tacit agreement that our traditional policy must change. And so there is an ideological continuity of what the Biden team is doing. And that's based upon realism. That's based upon what China is doing and what China capabilities are right now. So we have basically, I might also say, because America is a democracy, foreign policy is no longer done by a small group of geniuses behind the curtains of the White House. There is a wider participation of the American democratic process, particularly when it comes to foreign policy. And I might say the role the Congress play is vital. It's very, very crucial. And during the Trump administration, they passed a lot of China-related bills, almost all of them unanimously, which is pretty amazing in this deeply divided partisan country of ours. And even more importantly, every single of those China-related bills was signed by American presidents with alacrity. So the bipartisanship is not just manifested in Congress, but also in the different branches of the U.S. government, administrative, executive branch, as well as the legislative.
You mentioned this policy continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration when it comes to China issues. However, it looks different on the surface in some ways. For example, I remember Pompeo talked a lot about the Chinese Communist Party, specifically calling out the Communist Party, whereas Blinken mainly talks about China. His tone is a bit softer. Now, in terms of policy, as you mentioned, there's continuity. Would you say that this change in tactics or how China is talked about represents, is that a political strategy? Is that effective? Is it something else?
You're right. I think that there is this issue of a different degree of understanding of this China threat. I would say several things. Republicans basically believe that we have an ideological and institutional advantage over China, in the sense that our democratic system, although is not perfect, but is the best of all possible world. There are better ones, but those are impossible. So this is the best experiment in democracy and popular sovereignty. So we firmly believe in that. That's why when we're dealing with China, when China spear out this propaganda about their whole process democracy, and we can basically point out without any hesitation, they're just the nonsense. And we can say our system is better than yours, and if you don't believe it, let your people see what America is all about. Open up the cyberspace, for example, bring down the Great Firewall, and they wouldn't do that. So we are very, very convinced about that. And we believe the fundamental soundness and goodness of American system. The Democrats, on the other hand, I don't doubt they're all patriot, but they believe there are some systemic problems with the American institution. So their belief in the fundamental goodness of our American democracy is not as solid as ours, as Republicans. That's why when they say, "Oh, America has a systemic racism," the Chinese Communist government say, you know what? I'm going to tell you exactly that point that you are making domestically. So that's why when Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi lectured Blinken and Sullivan in Anchorage, Alaska, in the early month of the Biden administration, they could not mount a very robust rebuttal because the Chinese Communist propaganda pitch was exactly the main argument of the Democrats. So that's the difference. The other one on China, though, specifically, I think we basically harbor no hope that China has good intention to cooperate with the United States. The Democratic Party, however, is a party of a much more diverse interest groups. So there is a competing agendas. So, for example, there's a very dominant group of democratic politics nowadays that are green. They are climate change people. So they believe that's the fundamental threat to humanity. So based upon that kind of a party platform, they engage China, hoping China will be responsive. Because after all, China represents about nearly 30% of global green gas emission. United States, I believe, is about 13 or something. So we need China's cooperation. But that's just wishful thinking. China is never going to cooperate with the United States, whatever agenda you have, unless they can basically dominate you in the discourse, in the engagement. So I think because of that, China look at the Americans' eagerness to engage China as a weakness. So they could exploit. You can see that from the balloon incident, from their demands on a whole range of geopolitical and security issues. And I think we have been too timid, and I think we have been too sort of too nice to the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, yes, the key phrase is strategic competition. Competition is good with a term, but it's not really a correct one because the Chinese use the word the 斗争 struggle to define the relationship between U.S. and China. That's basically life and death struggle. Is you die, I live. 你死我活, as Xi Jinping always said. So we have to be very realistic. We have to really jettison all the wishful thinking about the degree to which China is a good player in international politics.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but maybe you just are racist against Asian people. Think of that?
Of course, I mean the Taiwanese are Asian people, Japanese are Asian people, so we have more Asian allies and friends in Asia than we have in many other parts of the world. So this play risk card again, is the Chinese Communist Party is a clever play using the unsavory practice of Americans far left using risk cards to blame on all the problems the society has, which is basically is futile. I mean, in the end, it's not going to work. The race, that is the most repressed, the biggest victims of injustice are the Chinese people themselves. What we're talking about when we talk about China, we're mostly in the foreign policy arena. We're most talking about the Chinese ruling elites, whose interests are fundamentally different from those of the Chinese people. So we have to understand the degree to which Chinese people are antagonistic and hostile to the repression and oppression of the Chinese Communist Party, which is committed daily over 1.4 billion people in that country.
So what do you think how should Americans counteract this kind of Chinese propaganda, and what should they be primarily concerned with regarding the Chinese Communist Party?
I think that we have to adopt an approach that the Secretary Pompeo correctly employed. That is, we should start with the assumption that the Chinese Communist Party cannot be trusted. And then it's incumbent upon them to prove otherwise. So that is distrust and verify. Because if you start with another assumption that Chinese government is redeemable in their global strategy and their practice and their egregious violation of human rights at home and abroad, I might say, and then you lose half the battle already, because the burden of proof of goodness should be upon them, not upon us.
I'd actually like to talk a little bit more about your background. You're from mainland China. You got your PhD in the United States in the early 90s. I'm curious how you ended up going from, a Chinese citizen to your position as a China hawk in the U.S.
Well, first of all, I don't consider myself a hawk. I'm probably a bird of a better quality. I would say maybe a Oriole. I mean, I'm next to Baltimore, or a Canadian goose. So,
lovely birds.
That's right, lovely birds. Yeah. So I have a fish pond here. So hawks are one of my worst enemies because they try to eat my fish. So the idea of labeling people's position on China as hawks or doves were not really entirely useful, because the nature and direction of the U.S.-China relationship were not really decided by the temperature of our China policy. Hawks or doves, ultimately, they play no role in deciding the ultimate direction of the U.S.-China relationship. We have to give the Chinese Communist Party its agency in developing and maintaining this relationship. Every single moment in U.S.-China relationship when dramatic events took place and causes in great disturbance, it's not because there's hawks or doves in Washington. It's because what Chinese government did or does. For example, the U.S.-China relationship went nosedive after 1989 Tiananmen massacre. We didn't do it. The Chinese government should bear responsibility for that worsening of U.S.-China relationship, right? So every single moment it's about that. So that's one thing. My personal journey actually is interesting only to myself. I came from China, but I will say I do have a personal experience of living under that regime. I was pretty taken by how influential during the Cold War, the immigrants to United States from Eastern Europe, from the Soviet Union, were, because they provide not only the narratives about the regime in Moscow, or in Prague, or in Warsaw, they also provide much deeper philosophical and intellectual understanding of the nature of the struggle between the free world and the totalitarian regime in the Eastern blocs. So, and that's basically inspired me to be more active, to get into the policy world. I remember I was completely shocked on the first day of the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. At the time, I was a graduate student doing research in the National Archives in D.C. When I visited that museum, and my conscience was deeply shaken because I saw the massacre of 6 million Jewish people in a faraway land could be remembered and could be honored 500 feet away from Washington Monument. And as a reminder to the world what evil can do to humanity. And I was ashamed of being a Chinese citizen at the time. I was also ashamed of being a historian for having failed to document or contributing to the memories of the tens of millions of Chinese people who perished under the Chinese Communist regime. So it is the sharp contrast between living in the totalitarian regime like China and then living in total freedom like living in the United States that really sort of give me the intellectual impetus to do what I'm doing and to say what I'm saying. And not as a policy advocate, but as a free person. And I think every person with the experience like the one I have should have the responsibility to basically to tell the world the fundamental difference and the stake of freedom to all of us. If we don't do that, and we should all be ashamed.
I mean, now that you mention it, it means so much to have the Holocaust Museum in the seat of power of the U.S. government, to have that monument of how bad things can get when government power runs unchecked. And that is definitely not a message the Communist Party is ever pushing.
You're absolutely right. And I might say, Chris, you are the host of a very influential program. And I think what you're doing is tremendously helpful because a China uncensored or unscripted is a China that will be free. Because freedom and the censorship do not go together. So you're doing the noble cause as well. You're on a noble mission too.
Well, thank you. This is why you're my favorite China Oriole.
Okay, great. That's not the reciprocal sort of a mutual admiration.
I mean, yeah, the Oriole's, it's one of the best birds, so it's up there.
I have the misperception that you've been Canadian, so I was going to say something about blue jays as being good birds too.
Oh. Well, it's nice that you could still have a good opinion of me, even thinking that I was Canadian. But
yeah. Canadian has a lot of
red-blooded American.
Canadian has a lot with lakes. I like that.
Well, I know you also said you've been were very inspired by President Ronald Reagan. I'm curious what caught your attention.
American presidents are important because the power given to them by the U.S. Constitution, but also American president is looked upon by a lot of people in the world as the leader of the free world. And for that, the American president has a lot of real power, but also the most important power is the power of inspiration. So to be a president is not easy. That means you have to understand the inspirational side of the American presidency, not only for American, but also Americans for a lot of people in the world. Ronald Reagan was one of the few people who could articulate with crystal clarity what American democracy means, not just for Americans, but also for a lot of people in the world. So he was a guy who could speak to the hearts of people who live in the repressive regimes. My inspiration from I was greatly inspired by President Reagan during the 1980 presidential election when I heard him debate Mr. Carter, um, the only presidential debate at the time. And I heard over Voice America simulcast in Mandarin. So that was really, really good. And President Reagan addressed literally a global audience about what American democracy means and what freedom means to every American and every people in the world aspiring to be free. So that was tremendously inspirational. In other words, Ronald Reagan, living through the Great Depression, living through the New Deal, living through the 1950s, very ideologically charged, living through how the Soviet infiltration worked in American elite circles, and he understood not only the operational side of the communist movement, but also he understand the ideological side of that. And I think that's something that's very rare and very, very unique.
Well, this is an interesting topic because it seems like today, the U.S. and China have very different models. And it seems like those two systems are competing for dominance in the world. Why? You've touched on this a bit, but why do you think the American model is superior?
Well, American model is superior because is built upon some of the incredible founding creeds. One of which is that obviously all men are created equal. If you want to find the inequality, you go to China and the party elites and a different classification of people. Literally written into laws, right? So that's a discrimination. And American democracy is good because also it's uncensored. There are some censorship going on in some new platforms of social media, but that's basically curable because there's no open debate. There is also legal recourse for those things. China is totally different. China is a country of unanimity of opinions, and it's one party rule, and so it's very different. And most importantly, when we say democracy is basically the people rule. That's a literal translation of Chinese 民主. So people being the master. Now, that really is important because that means the political party in charge would have to really work for the benefits of the maximum number of people, not just for the people who vote for you. So so that's why I think that America is free. It's rules based. It's democratic, and most importantly, America has a lot of fresh air and has a lot of career opportunities. I mean, those are all really a bread and butter thing, and America is becoming the most attractive place in the world. Each year, we gave over 1 million new immigrants, more than any country in the world. Each year, this nation's biggest problem is how to legally and morally manage the huge demand of people from all parts of the world who want to come to the United States. The longest lines in the world are those visa applicants lines in our embassies and consulates in many countries in the world, particularly in China, I might say. So this is one reason why America is good. And most importantly, America is also a force for good globally. Without Americans' commitment to global security, the world would have been very different. I mean, I think that China should be thankful to the United States too, because it is the United States military that provide global security and including some of the key sea lines of communication that enable free trade to prosper. And so that's why I think America is a much better country. China, on the other hand, is almost the exact opposite what America stands for.
As as many people want to get into the United States, there's equally as many people inside China, including Hong Kong, who want to get out of China and find that very difficult to do.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese Communist Party is innate instinct is to control. That include people's freedom of movement. So they were, if you look at some of the most inhumane, most rigid policies enacted by the Chinese Communist Party over the decades, is always about household registration, 户口, dossier system, 档案, right, and also work unit system, 单位. So those basically will pin one individual down on one particular spot of the locale. You cannot move anything. So freedom of movement is very, very important for China. And when you want to immigrate abroad, China basically, instinctively think that as some kind of a rejection of China, their motherland. So they have a very strong exit control, for example. In normal countries in the world, you have a passport, which every citizen is entitled to have. You're free to travel, right? All you need is basically to get the travel visa permit from the countries of destination. In many cases, if you are free and democratic, transparent, economically self-reliant, and you have basically visa-free travel advantages. So China does not have that. To get out of China is very difficult. To get out of China is almost as difficult as trying to get in China. So in many cases, and I think China wants to control its population also for a political purpose too. All communist regimes want to believe it's a paradise of the people. So when you have a mass exodus, that reflects very badly on the regime. So they try to prevent that kind of human wave of escape. This happened. This is the nature of the Berlin Wall. This is why Berlin Wall was erected in 1961, because the large number of people living under communism in East Germany were trying to get out of that repressive regime and went to freedom in West Berlin. So that's why wall has to be erected. And this is also what brought down the Berlin Wall in 1989, because a large number of East Germans tried to get out of the East Germany. And they stormed the borders with Hungary, with Czechoslovakia, and eventually the East German government had no choice but to basically open the gate at the Brandenburg, so to end a tragic era. So Chinese Communist Party is the same thing. They control exodus of dissidents, obviously, an ethnic minority under their repression, and the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. It's almost impossible to get an exit visa from the Chinese government. But also ordinary people right now, because they consider that as a betrayal.
Speaking of betrayals or perceived betrayals by ordinary Chinese citizens, the last November, there were the big protests, the white paper protests, which came kind of in the wake of the zero COVID policy. But you've made the point that those weren't really just about the zero COVID policy. So what do you think they were about?
Well, people in 1770s dumping tea into Boston Harbor is not just about their dislike of tea. It's about something much larger. It's about freedom. It's about independence, right? It's about fairness and the political representations, and much, much more. For the same reason, Xi Jinping's zero COVID national lockdowns only serve as a trigger of a subterranean force deep inside the Chinese society against the regime as a whole. So you see very quickly, any trigger like that white paper movement can quickly morph into a movement of much larger significance. The slogans are different. Participants were different. So it's no longer just people who refuse to take shot at the vaccine as demanded by the Chinese government. It's no longer the people who really don't like to be restricted in their homes. You can see the intellectuals jumped in, the students jumped in, uh, and the workers jumped in, and most importantly, the middle class, the property owner class in China, they all jumped in. So the regime suddenly realized, geez, it's a really a massive whole of nation uprising, and that's why, as arrogant as stubborn as Xi Jinping is, he had to suddenly reverse his favorite policy, the landmark signature policy of his administration, that is zero COVID uh, uh, lockdowns, and he also, to be honest with you, he also had no choice because those silly policies had literally ruined the nation's economy. The Chinese economy is in shambles today, mostly as a result of his a stupefyingly stupid policy of national lockdowns. And I think these points, of course, have been made by a lot of people, including Chris yourself. I remember I watched one of them, your shows.
Yeah, I was really amazed with the white paper protest. Just it seemed like it was the moment where, the Communist Party has always tried to divide people, make them suspicious of each other, make them turn on each other. The dojeng concept that you're talking about. But yeah, with the white paper process, it seemed like so many Chinese people for the first time realized that they weren't alone in disliking the Chinese Communist Party and hating the Communist Party.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mistake to believe that Chinese people are docile and basically accepting their fate of being slaves. There's anger. The resistance was subterranean, as I said earlier. There were oblique, often cases. So what they're waiting for are two things. One is the inspiration from outside, and also opportunities from within. This is the tragic logic of dictatorship. The moment the regime tries to improve itself in terms of governance, and the people they were repressing would see opportunity and weakness of the regime, and they will cause trouble for the regime. So the result is that the regime would enhance and strengthen their repression. So it's a vicious cycle because they know the nature of the regime is so reprehensive. The moment they loosen up, and then that laid the foundation for the demise of the repression. Secondly, I think the Chinese Communist Party lives in constant paranoia about outside influence. They basically is paranoid about the so-called color revolution, peaceful evolution, 和平演变, instigated by some anti-China forces. But most importantly, if you look at China's sort of a heightened rhetoric against Taiwan, in addition to Xi Jinping's egomania, there's also another very important part of that, as Taiwanese democracy has enormous impact and inspirational power over the people in China. If Taiwanese people, both Chinese-speaking, share Chinese heritage, can elect freely their own leaders, why can't the Chinese people do it? I mean, I was watching this report the other day on YouTube about this Taiwanese political show. It's called the Wave Makers, which is a Netflix production about how Taiwanese election officials handle their election processes. And that has enormous echo inside China. And so there's a lot of Chinese people are watching this kind of things. So I think, ultimately, I'm a very optimistic person. And I think, freedom, democracy will ultimately triumph over tyranny and repression.
We were actually in Taiwan for their 2020 election, and I would say even America could learn some things about how they run elections.
Oh, yeah. Taiwanese democracy is amazing. I mean, I don't want to brag about my advanced age, but in 2020, actually in 2000, this is some 23 years ago, I was an election observer from the United States. I was watching, this amazing enthusiasm of the Taiwanese people in participating in this free and fair election in Taiwan. Mr. Chen Shui-bian ultimately won. And I'm amazed by how Taiwanese democracy can leapfrog the world democratic processes and with so many good improved methods. For example, Taiwanese election always takes place on Saturdays, which is weekend. People don't work. In the United States, it's always Tuesday. A lot of people work. So and they do that to guarantee a much larger participation rate. Taiwanese election also has a rule that prohibit publication of polling data 10 days before the actual vote day, day of voting. I think that's very good because in the age of information, popular opinion can be easily manipulated by public relation firms and the political machinations. So that is a very good idea. So and I think Taiwanese democracy truly is amazing. It's a beacon of inspiration for people all over China.
So do you think that's why the CCP is so obsessed with Taiwan?
Because they want their democracy and they want to bring that to mainland China, right?
Right.
We have to understand the China threat, not just from the material capability side. We cannot just say China poses a threat to Taiwan because China has so many more missiles and aircraft and submarines. We have to understand the true nature of this epic struggle. It is ideological. It's about competition of ideas. My biggest criticism of the Trump Biden administration is dealing with China is we focus too much on technological competition, economic competition, but we forget the ultimate competition with China is a competition of superior ideology of freedom, democracy, human rights over the Chinese communist ideology. That is the essence of this struggle. And I think we have to address the issue of the essence of Taiwan-China struggle. That is ultimately, it's really about freedom versus tyranny, pure and simple.
So what happens if China is able to take Taiwan?
Well, first of all, that will be a tragedy of our century. Secondly, if that happens, and I truly believe the moribund nature of the Chinese communist ideology, ultimately is going to be cast into what, as the Chinese communists always say, the trash bin of history.
Do you think the Chinese Communist Party would be satisfied in its ambitions if it takes Taiwan, or does it have ambitions for the future beyond just Taiwan?
Oh, absolutely. Taiwan is just the beginning of the chain of aggression by the Chinese Communist Party. China's target is not just Taiwan. China has territorial dispute with virtually every one of its major land countries. South Korea, even though there's no land border, but they do have a maritime dispute. And Vietnam, India, the Philippines, and you name it. So China's not going to stop at Taiwan. So that's why the Taiwan's defense has become globalized, internationalized, and everybody's realized that. So the nature of the Taiwan conflict is no longer an issue over sovereignty of Taiwan, who should own it. It's becoming a much larger battle, the like of which we have seen in the defense of West Berlin and now in Ukraine. So that's why NATO, EU, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, the United States, everybody is talking about joint defense of Taiwan. So Taiwan is an international issue. As the president of South Korea, Mr. Yoon said very eloquently, like the North Korean issue, Taiwan is no longer a regional issue. It's truly a global issue.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. Mr. Yu, was a fascinating look at how U.S.-China policy is made. For anyone watching, where can they learn more about you or what you're working on? Where can they follow you?
Okay, so I have a weekly podcast at the Hudson Institute. It's called China Insider. You can go to Hudson's website, which is hudson.org, and you can find that and under China Center. I also have a Twitter account, which I discover is actually magical. So that Twitter handle is at MilesU10.
There were 9 before you, eh?
Hopefully not.
Well, we'll put links to all of that below. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. This was fascinating.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
And I'm Matt Gnesta.
We'll talk to you next time.